مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. هل هناك أمر ترغب بتحقيقه مرة في السنة؟ مثلا مطعم مفضل، مسرحية في برودواي، رحلة خاصة إلى الشاطئ. والآن اسأل نفسك، هل هناك شيئا تتمناه مرة كل 10 سنوات؟ هذا هو شعوري مع هذه الحلقة. ضيفي اليوم انضم إلينا في السنة الأولى من برنامج داخل واشنطن، وانضم إلينا مرة ثانية في السنة 10. وبينما يدخل البرنامج الآن في عام 20، يعود ضيفي ليظهر معي مرة ثالثة. ضيفي لم يكن يوما قائدا للجيش، ولم يتم انتخابه لأي منصب، ولم يمثل الحكومة في يوم من الأيام. بالنسبة إليه الكلم أقوى دائما من السيف. ضيفنا هو أهم مؤلق على السياسة الخارجية في أهم صحيفة في العالم. لسنوات عديدة جاب ضيفنا إرجاء العالم ليشرح لنا كيف تغير التكنولوجيا أسلوب حياتنا. كتب عن العالم مسطح، لكنه يركز الآن على 3 تحديات سياسية يعتقد أنها ستكرر مسار السياسة في هذا العقد: مستقبل إسرائيل والشرق الأوسط، مستقبل أوكرانيا وهي تواجه العدوان الروسي، ومستقبل الديمقراطية ومؤسساتنا الديمقراطية هنا في أمريكا. ضيفنا المميز لحلقة اليوم من برنامج داخل واشنطن هو توماس فريدمان. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. I am delighted to welcome back to the show one of our earliest guests who's been with us on our 10th anniversary, and now as we're entering our 20th year, I'm delighted to welcome back New York Times foreign affairs columnist Thomas Friedman. Tom, welcome.
We're going for 30, Rob.
Actually, Tom, when we first met, it was at the Le Rome Hotel, what was called the Le Rome Hotel in Jerusalem, 1986. The Middle East and the world has gone through enormous change since then, but some things remain. Israelis and Palestinians are still fighting it out. Iran is still a problem for its people in the world. And another American president is about to jump into solving all of this. So we're going to talk about all of this. Let's first start with a broad brush, some global questions, and then we'll get into the Middle East. When you look around the world today, and you've written books about everything in terms of global politics, what would you describe as the biggest challenge facing America today?
Well, the biggest challenge facing America today, Rob, is that we've entered what I'd call the post-Cold War world. Cold War world is one I grew up in, covered Secretary of State Baker at the end of it, saw the end of the Cold War, the fall of the wall, and the rise over the last 30 years of the post-Cold War world. That was a great time. It was a time of no great power war, lots of global integration driven by globalization, lots of people coming out of poverty around the world, and a time of relative rising peace and prosperity. I would define the post-Cold War world in 3 ways, Rob. Its features. One, it was a period of overwhelming American power, projection into the world to be the global stabilizer. It was a time of rising Chinese prosperity, which lifted a huge number of boats, not only in China, a country giant in itself, but around the world. And it was a time of stable borders in the Third World. We've now entered the post-Cold War world. It's a time of much more uncertain American power, much more uncertain Chinese growth, and a time of fracturing borders in the developing world. So a lot of people moving from south to north in both Africa, Europe, and South America, North America.
And how do you think we, the United States, is handling the challenge that you've just described?
Well, I think, one of the challenges we face is we're back in many ways, Rob, to a world of great power competition, a la World War II and the Cold War. The problem is we have an elite who never lived in that world. So Biden is really the last U.S. president who experienced the Cold War and that great power competition. And you can see it, Rob, in his instincts and impulses about rallying America to this moment. But we have two different generations now right behind Biden, and they're in our Congress and Senate, and it's reflected in the debate. You have one generation on the left who really grew up in a time where experienced the Iraq War, Afghanistan. They think the biggest problem in the world is too much American power. And they're certainly not kind of rising to this moment. And then you have another on the right with Donald Trump, who really are a throwback to the interwar period between World War I and World War II. They feel like, as back then, World War I was a failure, and so they were very isolationist about World War II. Well, these people feel all our adventures led by elites in Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera, were failures, and they're preaching isolationism. So it's a very difficult time to thread the needle between that Cold War, that generation that knew the Cold War, that knew great power competition, one that didn't know it at all and doesn't have any of the habits, and one that thinks of it in a really malign way. Yeah, the last time we tried to act as a great power after World War I and into World War II, we prefer to sit this out.
So that's a very worrisome situation.
Yeah.
If the choice is between isolationism and people who fear American power, do we have the leadership that will help deal with the huge challenges you just...
Well, I think we're lucky in that we have a Democratic administration now where even if the base of the party is more suspicious about American power, they want to support Joe Biden. So they're going along with more aid for Ukraine, more aid for Israel, more aid for Taiwan, and an immigration bill, which is also about American power. But it's a close call between them and the other instincts in the public right now, and Trump obviously represents a big part of a view of none of this matters. As J.D. Vance said, I don't care about Ukraine. I mean, that's that's shocking to people like me and my generation. But so that's what's at stake here. We're sitting here, Rob, on your 20th anniversary. I would argue at a real hinge of history, and this bill that stands before Congress that right now as we're speaking is one of those bills, like I would say the Civil Rights Act or Social Security, where how it swings will really define two very different histories. And so we're here at a really important hinge of history.
So just lay it out if you can just for a moment. There's a non-zero chance that Donald Trump is elected president before the end of this year. Put aside the domestic part of this. For our interests around the world, what impact, in your view, would that have?
Well, if you take him at his word, Donald Trump is someone who doesn't believe in NATO, really, thinks Vladimir Putin is someone who can be trusted, and is aggressive toward China in an economic way, but that's about it. And the Middle East, I don't know where Trump is. He's the guy who, on the one hand, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guards in Iran, and who, after Iran attacked the central oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia, sat by and said, hey, if you need some Patriot missiles, we'll sell you some. So we don't really even know who this guy is, I think partly because he doesn't know who he is, and a lot would depend on who he surrounds himself with.
You used to write over the years about so many issues, the world flattening, technological change, so many different things. Now you seem to have focused on a narrow group of issues, Ukraine, Israel, and Middle East, the threat to democracy here and abroad. Why?
Well, as I tell everyone, I really just write about Ukraine, Israel/Gaza, and Trump, because if Ukraine goes Putin, if Israel becomes a non-democracy, and God forbid Iran triumphs with its proxies in the region, and America elects Trump, the world I want to turn over to my two little grandchildren now, it's not the world that I ever imagined I would be turning over to them. It would be a much more dangerous, unstable, and less prosperous world.
Do you have residual confidence that our institutions over time will rise to the challenge, or do you have a deep and abiding fear that we're in a totally threatening, dangerous moment?
I think we're at a totally threatening, dangerous moment, Rob, for this reason. I put so much on social media. How people generate and consume news so much affects the two pillars of our democracy, which are truth and trust. So if we can't agree on what's true, if we can't trust each other, we can't go anywhere big, because big, hard things have to be done together. And so what worries me most is we're in an age of social networks where how people consume and share news has become a very volatile thing. And that's why you can find yourself in a conversation with someone now, someone really intelligent, who will feed back to you a clear conspiracy theory. You know, these are intelligent people, and I'm not, as you know, I'm not a hyper-partisan person. You know, I mean, I have a lot of Republican friends. I'm not the far left, I'm quite a centrist person, but people will now feed back to you crazy stuff. And it always reminds me of that line in the movie, Jack Nicholson, As Good as It Gets, where a lady knocks on his door and she asks him for something, and he says, who taught you to talk that way? It's like, where did that come from? And so how do you have a national dialogue when the tales now of this thing are just so crazy out there, you know? And I find that's the most worrying thing for me. If you can't agree what's true, you don't know which way to go. And if you can't have trust, you can't go there together.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to take this conversation into a deep dive into the Middle East with Tom Friedman in just a moment. My guest today is Thomas L. Friedman. Tom is an internationally renowned author, reporter, and columnist, the recipient of 3 Pulitzer Prizes, and the author of 7 best-selling books, among them From Beirut to Jerusalem and The World is Flat. A native of Minneapolis, Minnesota, a graduate of Brandeis University, and like me, St. Anthony's College, Oxford, Tom has had a storied career in journalism. He started with the venerable United Press International in London in 1978, moved to Beirut, where he joined the New York Times, with whom he has been ever since, in Lebanon, Israel, back here in Washington as chief diplomatic correspondent, chief White House correspondent, and chief international economics correspondent, before taking over the Times Foreign Affairs column in 1995, which he has kept remarkably for the past 29 years. Few journalists' words are as read as closely, with admiration by most, reverence by some, I'm afraid to say disdain by a few, as Tom Friedman. Tom?
I like the percentages, Rob.
So here's a question that I asked National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan just recently. For many, October 7th is a Rorschach test. Do you see it as part of the 100-year conflict between Jews and Arabs over Palestine, as part of the 45-year Iranian effort to expel America and its friends from the Middle East, or something else?
Well, I think what was going on in the world on October 6th, Rob, I mean, the big things going on in the world were that Ukraine was trying to join the West and Israel was trying to join the East. So Ukraine was trying to join the European Union and Russia moved to block it. And Israel was trying to have normal relations with Saudi Arabia with some kind of overture simultaneously toward Palestinians, and Iran and Hamas stopped it. I think at the 30,000-foot level, that's what's going on. Now, what happened, let's go to October 7th in the Middle East, is what this revealed, though, because the war revealed a lot of things. And what it revealed, I think, quite disturbingly, is that Hamas's attack was not about 1967. It was about 1947, okay? They didn't attack the West Bank. I mean, they attacked the heart of liberal Israel. And under the guise less of occupation and more that this whole enterprise is a colonial settler enterprise in Israel, and therefore it needs to be liberated from the river to the sea. That surprised me. Where did that come from? Okay. Now, I would argue there's no one explanation for this, but I think a lot of it, I put, as you know, I'm not a fan of Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I believe a lot of what we're seeing are the wages of his 16 years in office. That we have a generation now in America who've only known Bibi Netanyahu as Israel. That's all they've known. In Israel, that basically told American Jews, we don't really need you, we're going to bet on evangelicals. In Israel, that actually moved Israel and the Israel cause into the Republican camp openly, that defied President Obama and came here to speak in our Congress without his invitation, and that has continued to build settlements on the West Bank in a way that seems designed to preclude any two-state solution. There's a whole generation now of Americans, that's the only Israel they knew. Unlike Joe Biden, who knew Golda Meir, or unlike Tom Friedman, Rob Satloff, who knew Yitzhak Rabin's Israel, the Oslo Israel. This generation only knows that Israel. And therefore, and that sort of trend met the trend of sort of woke on college campuses, and they just combusted in Harvard Yard, I would argue, and combusted into a movement that basically situates Israel now in the context of a current narrative on the left of a settler colonial enterprise. And therefore, this is not about 67 for them. They're very comfortable talking about from the river to the sea. Now, in fairness to them, they're met in Israel by a much larger far right of religious nationalists who are also in the river to the sea camp, but from the far right in Israel. And so one of the saddest things, I'll stop here in this answer, about this moment, it seems to me, Rob, it's being driven by the worst of the worst on both sides. By the far right in Israel, who have Netanyahu as their captive, and on the most jihadist elements within the Palestinian community. And we're kind of caught in a war where I would argue, what are in my view, the worst of the worst on both sides are in the driver's seat.
You have articulated a Biden Doctrine, which envisions, if I can sum it up, a big bang approach to solving a whole range of Middle East problems with the clock ticking for President Biden. Yes. Tell us what you really...
Well, I articulated the Biden Doctrine by simply putting together three big initiatives that they are doing that actually are intertwined and need to be done together. On the one hand, it's an effort to deter Iran's probes into this region through its proxies. And what Iran does is probe, see how we react, probe, see how we react. It's a very devious but smart, and if they're very good at it, you know what I mean? And so never pushing so far that you want to roll up your sleeves and punch them. But that's sort of going on in one track. And so much so that they've implanted their proxies now in 4 states. Iran is the biggest occupying power in the region. They effectively control the government in Lebanon, Sana'a, Yemen, Damascus, Syria, and Baghdad. And so on the one hand, if you want the forces of inclusion in the region to come together, you're going to have to push back on that Iranian influence. On the other hand, Rob, to get the legitimacy to build a coalition to push back on that Iranian influence, you need to have a horizon for a Palestinian state and an effective, legitimate, credible Palestinian partner that can work with Israel both on a post-Gaza strategy and ultimately a 2-state solution, a demilitarized state for Palestinians. It's going to take time, but you need that. That partner is the cement you need, I think, to take on Iran's malign influence in the area. And third part of that is to get Israelis to have that Palestinian partner, to raise the inducement. You normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which I think can change the debate within Israel. And at the same time, you do it in the context of also creating that Palestinian partner and that kind of relationship with Israel. So the three really fit together. You can't take on Iran without an effective Palestinian partner. You can't get an effective Palestinian partner, I would say today, in part unless you have Israel-Saudi normalization that kind of changes the inducements for the Israeli public. So that's what I call the Biden Doctrine.
I've heard two broad skeptical approaches, responses to this.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about each of them.
Yeah.
One says Arabs are going to do against Iran what Arabs are going to do. They don't need the Palestinian issue to convince them of the threat from Iran. What's the connection? Why does a Palestinian state suddenly unleash Arab states to do things that they haven't already done?
My answer to that is, the Houthis in Yemen have been firing rockets, at ships passing in the Red Sea that have now completely disrupted global shipping and raised shipping rates all over the world. Ships now have to go through around the Cape of Good Hope, can't go through the Suez Canal. I mean, is there a more global sort of threat that they have manifest? How many allies could we muster to take on the Houthis? One, Great Britain. I think that's a pretty damning number. I would argue if Israel were in a different process with the Palestinians, we would have had a lot easier time generating the kind of regional partners to take them on and to push back on Iran. I'm not going to exaggerate it, but I wouldn't minimize it either. That's a damning number, that these people have completely disrupted global shipping and only one other country wants to stand next to us, and that's Great Britain.
All right. The other big critique that I've heard is along this lines. Wouldn't it be reasonable for Israelis to say, really? We just got this horrible attack, October 7, and now within 4 months, Palestinians get rewarded with a Palestinian state, and we get some amorphous relationship with some prince in the Arabian Gulf who may or may not ever want to shake our hands. We'll find out. But is that really what the appropriate response to October 7th is?
Well, again, there's Palestinian state and there's Palestinian state. So let's start there. I think one thing we've learned from the peace process of the old, Israel withdraws, you get a state. That ain't going to happen this time. That's not going to work. The U.S. is contemplating recognizing a Palestinian state in principle, but then laying down a set of metrics that Palestinians will have to achieve in terms of institution building, security force building, and partnership with Israel, that only then would that state be formally recognized. I happen to think that's good for Palestinians to have that out there. I think it's good for Israelis. So I don't think this is your grandfather's Palestinian state, number one, we're talking about. Number two, Rob, I would say this. I looked at the paper the other day. It was day 104 of the war in Gaza. And on day 104 on the war in Gaza, I believe the number is right, you fact checkers can, Hamas fired 50 rockets into central Israel. Now think about that. On day 104 of this war, Hamas still had the capacity to build and fire 50 rockets into central Israel. Now those are all dumb rockets, basically. They're not precision guided. We are on the cusp of precision weapons, which you already see being deployed on the Lebanon front. But, Rob, I spent my career guided by one rule. I will never describe the problem for you. I'll only describe the solution.
Absolutely terrific. Tom Friedman, thank you so much for joining us on داخل Washington.
My pleasure, Rob. Thank you.
وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة اليوم من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إن كانت لديكم استفسارات أو تعليقات على البرنامج وخاصة حول إمكانية تحقيق السلام فيما بعد الحرب الحالية في الشرق الأوسط، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مراسلتي مباشرة @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا وإلى اللقاء.